Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this week. My name is Liz Mangus, Literacy Specialist with Saddleback Educational Publishing. You know the routine. We'll get started right at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. But as you are beginning to sign in, please locate your control bar, which is at the bottom of your web browser window. And that is where you will find the chat, the Q&A, and the live transcript icons. We do want you to chat with us today. So if you could go to the chat right now, click on it, go ahead and select everyone from the drop down. This will ensure that everybody who's participating today will be able to see your comments. And then just type and let us know where you're joining us from today. If you have questions as we go throughout our session today, go ahead and put those in the Q&A area. We will get to questions at the end of the session today. You can also put them in the chat. That's okay too, but sometimes we miss them if they're in the chat. So it's better to put them in the Q&A because it's easier for us to see. And if you would like to take advantage of subtitles, you can click on live transcript and then select show subtitle. Don't forget, we are on Twitter. Go ahead and follow us, say hello, mention us, let everybody know you are joining us for this great learning conversation today. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Let's see who's here. People are slowly signing in. Hello, Robert. Hello, Adeline. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We know it's the end of the school year. You are the real heroes for joining us today at the end of a long day for many of you and long school year. So thank you so much for signing in today. Well, let's say hello to our presenter today. We have Professor Jill Watson joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing great and very excited to be here. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. This is a topic we have been searching to address and bring the conversation to the webinar platform. So we're very grateful to you for taking this opportunity to come and lead us in this conversation. So thank you for your time and your willingness to share with us. Those of you who are joining, before I forget, I want to let you know, we will use the full hour today. So this is a topic that deserves a lot of time and space. It's intriguing, it's important, and it's not one that we very often get to delve into. So we want to let you know up front that we plan on using our time today, and we hope that you are able to stick with us. And for those of you who are joining us on the recording later on, this is going to be an hour full of very insightful learning. So thank you for joining us. Hello, Philomena. Thank you for joining us. This is great. All right. I see we already have a question. Oh, this is Nicole. Hi, Nicole, joining us from Rochester, New York. Thank you very much. All right. So we are just about ready to get started. Let me go ahead and officially launch because, as I said, we will be using the full hour today. So we want to be mindful of starting on time. So our topic today is Indigenous educational practices in the SLIFE classroom. We're really talking about the convergence, right? The convergence between Indigenous educational practices and SLIFE. So, so much to talk about here, so much to learn. And to lead us in this conversation, we have Professor Jill Watson joining us. She's a first-time presenter on our platform, so let me go ahead and give her a little bit more of a formal introduction. So Jill Watson is a career ESL and world language teacher and teacher educator. She has taught at the University of Minnesota, Cornell University, and Hamline University, and is Associate Professor of English as an Additional Language and World Languages Education at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. She consults extensively with school districts on strengthening English learner service, with a particular focus on the learning needs of students with limited or interrupted formal education. She is fluent in English, French, and German, and conversant in Spanish, and has studied several other languages, including Somali and Lakota. So thank you so much for being here. And I know you have some research in this area and are very gracious to share what you've learned along the way about this topic. So thank you, Jill. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And I'll let you take it from here, Jill.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring up my slides. Thanks so much, Liz, and welcome everybody. It's such an honor and really I'm very humbled to be able to have a chance to talk about this important topic, and I come at it from a very unique vantage perspective, which I would like to take note of as we begin. As Liz mentioned, I have been in language education for all of my career, but the part that is also relevant here that I want to mention is I grew up in the low population state of South Dakota, which is mostly comprised of Indian reservations and tribal homelands. And I come to this topic with a combination of a professional and a personal perspective. I, like many of you, I've been a classroom teacher. I'm licensed in ESL and French in Minnesota. I have been in higher education for a while, but haven't lost my connection to the classroom. So let me just start by sharing that I began with, I began my ESL teaching career without the slightest clue of what the importance, the priority, the influence of prior education on student learning, especially at the secondary level. And it was in, well, 2004, some of you might recall that the very first research article by Martha Bigelow and Elaine Tyrone was published regarding the population of students who come to a new country, a new language and school without prior literacy and schooling, or with limited prior literacy and schooling. So my first learning threshold was, learning the difference between somebody who comes having literacy and schooling and lots of academic experience coming into a high school classroom versus someone for whom that is perhaps the first formal learning experience that they've had, and their family history springs from oral culture. So along the way, I developed such a passion and a commitment to this community of learners we now call SLIFE, students with limited or interrupted formal education. I know there are other ways to refer to this group of people, but that's what we use in Minnesota, so I will use that. But then, I did a dissertation focused on the encounter of oral cultural background with the hyperliteracy present in Western schooling. And as I researched more and more deeply on that topic, I began to explore the areas of how oral cultures, indigenous oral cultures from the entire world, no matter what the geography, how often they have very unique and distinct patterns and educational values in common. And so my research, this has been, a number of years ago, but it kind of got launched there. And then I just set out on a quest, an older white lady, American, to try to understand more as a student, as a learner of oral indigenous culture, what are some of the practices that are treasured and that are transmitted and that are important to students who come into our classrooms. As ESL teachers, we might think of them as SLIFE, which certainly has been a passion of mine. But the more I work in this area, the more I think we're talking about students from oral indigenous cultures the world over, including here in North America, where I am. And I began to really encounter and contemplate and explore the convergences between what we think of as SLIFE learning orientation and oral indigenous education. And that's what today's topic is all about. So let me just announce now at the beginning my positionality. I am a learner of these practices. I'm learning Somali, and I've been to the Horn of Africa, and I've visited Somali villages that are the same as they were. This is what one of the ladies I met said, this is the same as it was 500 years ago, right here. And I yes, ma'am, I believe you. And I've also taken steps to learn more about indigenous cultures of the area where I live, particularly Ojibwe, Ho-Chunk, here in my Minnesota area, and also Lakota, Dakota, Nakota from my home state of South Dakota. So what you see on the screen in front of you are some representative images of indigenous cultures that I have had the pleasure and the honor of learning more about. I definitely don't want to portray that I'm an expert in all indigenous cultures. I'm not even a member of a strictly speaking oral indigenous culture, but I am an avid learner. And as a teacher, let me wrap this all up for everybody as we get started. As a teacher, how many times have we thought about culturally relevant teaching? How many times have we attended PD or PLCs and talked about and implemented culturally relevant teaching? Please put this presentation under that rubric in your thoughts. I want to present this as really an imperative, as an important priority, that when we are teaching students coming from the indigenous cultures of the world in our classrooms in the United States or other Western countries, one of the things we need to engage in is not just translanguaging, but also transculturing. The cultures that they come from, if we activate the values that are present there, my understanding and my hope and my belief in culturally relevant pedagogy and teaching is that allows students not only to learn better in an academic setting, but also to acquire the crucial sense of belonging, which indeed they do belong, but they don't always get the message that they belong. And so that's the overview of my background and my grounding in terms of this topic. And we will talk about, I will share about all of the images more that you see on the screen as we go along. So this isn't the end of it, it's just a beginning to get us started. So speaking of getting us started, what I want to do is take you to two places in the world that have astoundingly similar perspectives on education. And the first place I want to take you is to the Akan people of Ghana, West Africa, and one of their most amazing representatives, Professor Yata Kanu, has been a great teacher of mine. Of course, I haven't met her. I read her work, and she's a great teacher of mine in that way. But she shares very eloquently on the concept of Sankofa, which she says reconciles the best in the wisdom of our ancestors, the best of our tradition, with the changing realities of the present. Very consciously bringing this notion of Sankofa into what they call the Sankofa initiative, to not just forge ahead into standards and rubrics and Western education, but to explore, cherish, retain, and reconcile the best wisdom of the past. So keep that one image in your mind. And now I'm going to take you to another part of the world. This part of the world is the home state where I grew up. Sinte Gillespie University is located in Rosebud, South Dakota. It is a university which has an education department and licenses teachers, and they are very clear about stating the pedagogy espoused by the education department is respectful of the values of the Lakota that are based in past tradition and are requisite for the future. As you can see on your screen, some of them are listed, the values of bravery, generosity, wisdom, and fortitude. And we will go into some of the Indigenous values in this presentation. But what I really want you to notice at this moment is how very similar these two perspectives on education are, even though they come from very different parts of the world, both representative of educational values springing from oral Indigenous culture. With that as a overall cultural starting point, let me introduce this starting point, which is in fact inspired by the Indigenous education research that I've been able to do. And here it is. I want to just state it and lay it out. This is one of the things I've learned in my research. Early childhood 12 education is, at its heart, a relationship between elders and youth. It's an agreement between generations that elders, be it individuals, communities, institutions, or systems, will help young people find their way toward the future, and that they, the young people, will someday do the same. In a sense, it's a question of direction. As David G. Smith from University of Alberta in Canada puts it, the teacher says, okay, all eyes on me, but the deeper question for us epistemologically today is, where do his or her eyes look? In other words, what vision of the future are we holding out to the young in our educational practices? In the process of this research, excuse me, it was not lost on me that we are talking about an intergenerational dynamic. And that Western culture has a history of wrestling with this intergenerational dynamic. And in fact, that wrestling has been ensconced in popular culture. And now I'm going to evoke a couple of images that viewers might be familiar with to bring into focus the intergenerational dynamic at the heart of education. Now, the first, a little bit predates me, but not much. Perhaps you know the movie Rebel Without a Cause. It's such an iconic film. It hit the scene in 1955 in the United States. And I don't know whether you're familiar with the story, but the character played by James Dean is famously tormented by the hypocrisy he sees in elders. They say one thing and they do another. They even encourage hypocrisy. They encourage law breaking while punishing him for breaking the law. And at one famous moment in the movie, he's in jail where his dad is going to bail him out and is yelling at him for being, for not obeying what he had said, when in fact he directly did obey it. And here's James Dean pulling on that amazing hair of his, yelling, "You're tearing me apart." And that is an unforgettable moment I hope some of you have in your mind of a younger generation looking for inspiration and honesty and authenticity from elders. Here's another example, the same decade, 1959, I think, the very famous American novel Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Many school students still read this novel. But here too, the topic is about the intergenerational dynamic, and Holden Caulfield, the protagonist, pictured here in cartoon form, one of his position is, "Why won't you realize you're all phonies? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills." And this relates to, if I obey what my parents and society are telling me to do, I will end up not like them. They themselves aren't obeying. They themselves aren't following their own precepts. So those are two pieces from the past, but more recently, now this is in the 1980s, 1985, the movie The Breakfast Club appeared in the United States. And notice that this is set in a school. I'm sure some of you are nodding and remembering this movie. It's got quite a cast of characters, some misfits, a jock, a nerd, whatever that means, a princess, kids who are at a Saturday detention experience in their school, in their high school library. But here's the point I want to make here for us today, is that the vice principal, Mr. Vernon, pictured on the right, in fact, he turns out to be the greatest villain in the movie. I think of anyone, he should have been in detention and they should have been out. He actually challenges one of the kids to a fist fight and goads him and tries extremely hard to get him to engage in a physical fight. And the kid, played by Judd Nelson, pictured on the left among the students, he just stares at Mr. Vernon kind of like James Dean, like, you're tearing me apart. I can't believe. I mean, I know that I broke the school rules, but you're supposed to be the adult. And it's just this crushing experience. Okay, one more popular culture example, also set in school. I want to transition this to a school kind of a context. Perhaps you've seen or heard of the movie The Dead Poets Society. Came out of the United States in 1989. Of course, it portrayed an earlier era, a boys' boarding school. And basically, Mr. Keating comes on the scene and encourages the boys to think for themselves and not just swallow everything that they hear, or to just let difficult conflicts, just let them sit. He encourages them to explore hypocrisies that they hear, and he becomes a great hero among the students. And in the end, there's a very tragic outcome. But okay, now I'm going to gather all these things together. From James Dean to Holden Caulfield to The Breakfast Club to the Dead Poets Society, we're talking about a culture that is wrestling with the same questions that that we will go into today. What is the relationship between youth and elders? And so I want to suggest, inspired by Seidman's excellent piece, that we were talking about the difference between formal authority and moral authority. Formal authority is like what Mr. Vernon, the vice principal, has. he has the reins of authority formally, but does he have the moral authority, which Seidman points out is built on the twin pillars of truth and trust, exactly what each of those stories I just discussed was addressed as their primary topic. So one way to look at this now, which will help us transition into thinking about Indigenous educational values, is to think of what is moral authority? Where does it come from? And one way to think about it is that having themselves survived ordeals in life, challenges, difficulties, and come out with deeper wisdom, elders actually have something to share with youth. Now, this doesn't by any means imply that just growing older means that you have acquired wisdom. Although the older I get, I kind of hope that's true. But we're talking about having navigated through difficulties and coming out alive on the other side and being able to model that for young people and guide them in that quest. And so let me now engage all of what I've been speaking about into looking at, okay, we're talking about basically two groups that are very, very seldom compared. One is students with limited or interrupted formal education. And I want to contextualize by looking very specifically at their historical grounding as we meet them in Western classrooms. So we know that most SLIFE come from cultures where oral Indigenous values are treasured and practiced. Not all, but most. We also know that trauma in the homeland and immigration to the new country, wherever that may be, a country oriented toward Western values, that this entails cultural attrition and rupture. We see it all the time. As a teacher of, in many cases, 100% SLIFE in my classroom, it is not just a matter of learning educational skills, but witnessing before your eyes the incredible abyss that students have to cross, and how their culture is, the cultural attrition that occurs is very, very evident. And so to bring back the notion of culturally relevant teaching, what I would like to submit to you is that culturally relevant or sensitive or sustaining teaching for these students has to include understanding and integrating practices that stem from oral Indigenous cultures in order that our teaching, our classrooms will be healing, sustaining, and empowering, which is what we all want as teachers. Okay, that's the grounding I would like to just evoke in terms of SLIFE. And now I'd like to turn to thinking about the context in which I live and I grew up, Native America, and the particular historical grounding of these populations. Like most SLIFE, Native American cultures are based on traditional oral Indigenous values and practices. We also know that forced relocation and genocide caused by the American government and Western expansion of settlers caused grave cultural breakdown, loss of language, culture, practices, values, not to mention loss of life. In this era when we're learning more and more about the horrors in Indian boarding schools, there's no denying the incredible, horrifying cultural rupture that has occurred with those people in their communities. So you can see that there is, similar to SLIFE, if we're going to have, engage in culturally relevant teaching with Native American students, then we also need to include understanding and integrating practices that stem from oral Indigenous culture, just as with SLIFE, in order for our classrooms to be healing, sustaining, and empowering. So to get us into the zone of thinking about teachers and SLIFE educators in particular, of which I'm one, what I want to do is raise these questions to let them resonate in your mind as we go forward, and I share some specifics. What can we learn from attending to traditional oral Indigenous educational practices? Believe me when I say much of what I learned over the last 10, 15 years was new to me, and I'm sure it would be new to many of you. And so what can we learn to make our teaching more culturally relevant and support belonging and empowerment? How can we incorporate Indigenous educational practices in our classrooms? That's a challenge I'm going to give you as we go forward here during this presentation. And how would doing so benefit SLIFE and indeed all students in the classroom. Because as I took a little bit of trouble to point out, the intergenerational dynamic in Western cultures in the United States indicates that there is also a rupture there between young people and people who are supposed to be in charge of everything. And we as teachers, we know about this because we're kind of poised right on the fault line of young people and the dominant culture. So as I mentioned, this is a project that I have been engaging in particular to understand the traditional educational values of Indigenous cultures. And here I want to start us out with a couple of very hard fought, I mean, very thoughtfully, very carefully explored patterns that I have learned, and I want to share and set us off in this direction. So one is that oral Indigenous cultures from around the world have more in common with each other in terms of values, understanding, and educational practices than these cultures have in common with Western standardized education. I'm going to share a couple of astounding examples in a moment. So I'm just going to give here a quick positionality note. My primary foci at this point are the cultures and people I've gotten to know either in my personal life or in the classroom in my professional life, including Chaga, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Dinka, Fon, Fula, Hmong, Ho-Chunk, Karen, Khmer, Mandingo, Nuer, Ojibwe, Oromo, Somali, Yoruba. These are the cultures I'm the most familiar with, but my reading and research have gone beyond just a focus on these cultures. However, I think it's important to call out a positionality note now and then, and so that's the spirit of that. So here's a couple of notable, amazing examples of joint projects. For instance, the Native American Somali Friendship Committee. Here in Minnesota, we have the largest community of Somali immigrants of any place in, actually anywhere outside of Mogadishu is the largest population of Somali background people. And a lot of people from the Somali community were relocated when they came in as refugees. They were relocated to a neighborhood we call the Cedar neighborhood in Minneapolis. And that neighborhood also is the center of Native American community in Minneapolis. So they're right in that same geographic area. The Native American Somali Friendship Committee sprung up, looking at the commonalities in the two cultures and working on issues that face the two communities. So that was one astounding example. And you see here this the photograph, you see some members of the Somali community and the Native American community joining together there. Another really amazing occurrence that I came across was what is known as the Widening the Circle conference. I had already begun the research before I learned about this conference, but I kind of was, doing searches, even Google searches, like is anybody looking at refugee and Native American convergences? And I found this amazing conference. So let me just share a little bit from their website, which I gave at the bottom of the screen. What their goal is to create an environment which provides educators and students a culturally responsive model of critical, multicultural, and Indigenous, specifically Native and Hmong education. And in honor of this conference, I'm wearing these amazing Hmong earrings that a student gave me. I did attend this conference, and I can tell you that I presented there also. I was one of 3 white people at the conference, and it was so amazing to see the Hmong community and the Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk Native communities working together and discovering commonalities. And what they are hoping to do, and this is what we can take this as a call for us as teachers, develop a critical consciousness to deconstruct biases and stereotypes, to begin to see how our practice and current educational policies can be problematic for students, just as they were for, in another form, in another era, for Holden Caulfield or James Dean. We're talking about problematic practices that often go uninterrogated, which specifically affect Native and and immigrant Indigenous communities, in this case, Native and Hmong. So in the spring, they hold a conference. It's at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and they also have a speaker series. I strongly encourage you to look into this amazing example of these communities finding each other along the same lines that inspired my research. So at this point, what I would like to do is just make one more very strong positionality note. What I'm going to do today is share what I acknowledge as a small sample of Indigenous educational values and practices offered by me, a Western scholar, an outsider, a student of these practices. And I need to go just a little bit farther. I've already shared that I was an ESL teacher. I worked with SLIFE. I still am very, very much dedicated and committed to working with and on behalf of and advocating for SLIFE. But I want to just go ahead and say something out loud that I don't always, it doesn't always seem to be relevant in talking about SLIFE, but it is. And that's that my grandparents homesteaded to South Dakota. My grandfather dug the first well in north central South Dakota, which so strongly contributed to the success of white settler colonialism in that area. And that the college where I teach right now rests on Lakota land. So like many of you and others who work with and on behalf of students with limited or interrupted formal education, my history is conflicted. I am the product of hardworking and themselves, very challenged people. My mother grew up without indoor plumbing. Many times my students from abroad, they don't believe that, but it's true. But my own history depended on supplanting violently. I don't know about violence in my own family, but we know about violence in general. It depended on supplanting the Native people who already were there before. And so I want to just doubly express the humility with which I undertake this project, and that I strongly welcome. I always mention and sometimes receive input from participants and listeners that would be palliative, helpful, corrective to anything that I'm saying or mentioning in terms of Indigenous patterns and practices. So let that, please hold that positionality note close to your understanding as I hold it close to my heart. I realize that this is a very conflicted history, and many people share the same kind of conflict as I hold. So, okay. I would like to talk now, exactly using the term that Liz shared at the beginning, some of the convergences in traditional Indigenous education. And what I have learned in this pretty long and serious research is that we're talking about values and practices and some astounding commonalities across geographies. And I started out by pointing out really different geographies, West Africa and the north central part of the United States, very different geographies, but really strong convergences. And I'd like to now just dig very specifically into these convergences, and I'm going to ask you to consider how they compare to US cultural values and educational practices. In fact, at one point I wish we could have interaction, but I'll just let you put in the chat what you're noticing. So please think about what I'm going to share, and then think about how that compares to what we experience in US classrooms. So the first value that I want to share that I cannot emphasize the importance of enough is what in Native scholarship is called elder epistemology. This is basically the tenet that holds that elders are the keepers of collective knowledge and the values of oral Indigenous cultures. The most knowledgeable person in the room is the oldest person. I cannot even tell you how many hundreds of times I have been reminded of this and told this. One of the populations we have a lot of members in Minnesota is the Oromo people from the area of Ethiopia, approximately Oromia. They have a saying, which I know is echoed in many other cultural groups, but they have the saying, when an elder dies, a library is lost. Now pause and think for a moment what a what a place the library is. You know, it's in the middle of the school. It has all the authoritative materials. If you need to know something, of course, now we have digital versions of library, but we're talking about old human beings having the same weight as a library, or even more. One example I experienced myself that I have to say I really liked it was when I was at the Widening the Circle conference, and I did a presentation there. I was one of very, very few white people in the group, and yet when they have meals, they make a very serious point of having the oldest people go through the line first. And here I am sitting at this table by myself because I don't know anybody, but somebody came up to me and I appeared to be older than some of the people. So they kind of encouraged me to go up to the line at my appropriate point. And I thought, that is just the exact opposite of what happens in so many situations where we let the young people go first. And, you know, I'm just saying, it's a very different value, and it's very, very important and cherished, is that the elders are the keepers of knowledge, and they deserve the most respect, and they're the most consultable of all. So I want to, you know, that basically, what is the job of elders? Elders are supposed to, their responsibility is to transmit and share practices and values that connect youth to the past and to the future. We also have a very large Karen population here in Minnesota. I saw someone from New York, from Rochester, New York. I know that there's my students in Minnesota. I taught at Cornell for a year, and they go, "Oh, New York, Utica," because yeah, the city of Utica, New York, has a large Karen population too. So anyway, one of the examples of people transmitting knowledge and belonging to young people is the Karen wrist tying ceremony, which symbolizes unity of Karen people, or unity even between peoples. Some of my students they've sort of acted this out with me, not in a very formal way, but they just wanted to share with me how much it meant to them. And I think that's a beautiful and amazing example. So another place where we see this respect for elders is right in the structure of languages themselves. So for instance, I wanted to just share some amazing examples. The word for elder in Ojibwe language is Gichiaya, which literally means great being. So, okay, teachers, how many of you would like to be thought of as great beings or greeted as a great being when the students come into the class? And interestingly, the Lakota word for children is Wakanyeja, which means sacred beings, meaning that, you know, teachers are kind of like great beings who are caring for sacred beings. And that's the intergenerational dynamic. We can also note in this connection that honorifics for adults in cultures all over the world, and I know many of you are thinking of examples right this minute, like uncle, aunt, or grandmother, grandfather. You give a title when you speak to an older person. Once again, in Karen language, one example would be, I asked a Karen, a really good friend that I worked on, actually a lawsuit with. I was the expert witness and he was the plaintiff, regarding his SLIFE children not receiving appropriate education, which I can tell you all about on another occasion. But he shared with me some examples, like in Karen, you can't ever just address an older person with just their name. You have to use a title. So an older sister would be Na, or an older brother is Ja. A much older person for a female would be Muga, and for a male would be Di. And a highly respected elder for a male would be Thera, and for a female would be Thera Mu. And all of this, I can't even think of anything like a corollary in my experience growing up as an American. But it's like embedded in respect for elders is so embedded even in language. So now I'm going to, take a little risk and not follow a strict script, but I want to share two very stark contrasting examples about differing views of elders in Western or American culture versus in an Indigenous oral culture. So first I'm going to share what I call the Dig Me example. This was a very cool project run by the University of Minnesota at a high school in Minneapolis, at Wellstone High School and Roosevelt High School back then, where the point was to provide really strong support so that students could learn digital literacy. And many of the students who participated were newcomer arrivals, or their families were recent arrivals, people from the Somali community, people from the Mom community, and others. And so I attended a presentation about this amazing project, which absolutely did empower students and gave them great skills. But here's what the one little piece that sort of stuck in my craw that I want to share with you is one of the professors running the project, and I've talked to her about this since then. She was sharing an example of how a student was, a long quote she shared from the student, that I finally, now I know how to do everything. I know how to do Word, Microsoft Word. I know how to make a PowerPoint, which is great because, like my grandparents don't even know about PowerPoints. They're so stupid. They have never even heard of PowerPoints. And I'm just sitting there listening to this presentation, kind of shocked to the core that, does this really, if we acquire new skills in a new culture, in an ESL classroom or in a school, does it really require, how did it come that student thought that her grandparents were stupid because they didn't know about PowerPoint? You can bet she probably doesn't really think they're stupid, but there's a cool factor in like acquiring the dominant culture patterns and knowledge, such as digital literacy. And that came out so starkly in that example. The contrasting example that I want to share is one from my very own personal classroom. So I had a student, Amadou, this is so many years ago, 20 years ago. He was from Sierra Leone, oral cultural background. They were Fula. And he and his three brothers joined my classroom at the same time. And I'd loved having them being their teacher, and I got to know them so well, especially Amadou. He was 20 years old when he started high school. He had never encountered literacy, had never read anything or written anything. High school was incredibly difficult for him. But he was a great guy. And when we traveled back to South Dakota for Thanksgiving, I invited him to come along, and he did. And we stayed at my husband's family's house, where my father-in-law, then 85 years old, on oxygen and blind, would like to sit for hours and tell old stories about stuff that used to happen. And he would go on and on and on. And, like everyone's heard these a million times. But there on the floor, crouched in front of my father-in-law, Lefty, was Amadou. He was like crouched in this, holding his knees and listening for hours and hours, and like nodding and smiling and listening. And it was just amazing. And so after we got home, I talked to my mother-in-law, and she said, that young man, what a nice young man. And he was so interested in Lefty's stories. I didn't have the heart to tell her that he didn't have enough English to understand hardly anything of what Lefty said. It was just the fact of an elder, clearly the oldest in the room, the most consultable, with the most knowledge, talking and sharing and talking orally. And that's all Amadou needed, to just go into the zone of just, I'm going to be taking up my role as a listener. So these are quite astounding, contrasting examples. And I wanted to share those two with you. So the next educational value of Indigenous cultures that I want to talk about is longitudinality and apprenticeship. So now, once again, I asked you to compare, how does this compare with US practices? So in Indigenous cultures, knowledge and growth are viewed over time, longer than a unit, semester, or year. And many of the most successful practices focus on long-term projects that tie many tasks and lessons together thematically, where young people learn from an elder, they watch and practice, and learning supports the life of the community in material, psychological, and spiritual ways. I have so many times been reminded and told that Indigenous education is not constructivist in the Western sense. And this is one of the ways in which it's very, very distinct. So for instance, one of the projects that exemplifies this is this, you see this image of a Somali elder teaching kids how to build a traditional house. And I have seen these houses. I've traveled to the Horn of Africa. I've seen exactly what kind of house this is. They're very complex and they're very difficult to construct. And so these kids are learning how to do this from an elder. In Minneapolis, we have the Somali Museum of Minnesota. And when I went there, I saw a house very much like this. And I said to the director of the museum, well, that's amazing. That's just like a real traditional house. And he said, not knowing anything about my work, he said, yes, this is how Somali kids learn geometry. And I thought, okay, yeah. You know, it's a project that supports the community. It's mentored by an elder, kids watch and learn apprenticeship. Another example that is really astounding, and I want to share a little bit more about, is the project These Canoes Carry Culture, Wigwasi Jiman, which I learned about at the Widening the Circle conference from Wayne Valliere, a professor at University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. And this is a project they intentionally implemented to teach Ojibwe youth, not only Ojibwe language, but also cultural values. And they did it through the very lengthy process of building a birch bark canoe. I mean, all the steps of the process: growing the trees, harvesting bark, roots, preparing materials, making the charcoal that they put on the outside of the canoe, learning to do each task until completion, and then taking the canoe out. And Professor Valliere shared with us, and then they take it out and they harvest rice and they have a huge feast to celebrate. And what he pointed out to all the people attending his session was that all generations are connected, knowledge is purposeful and life-giving, and material objects are not just objects, they carry special meaning of the canoe in this case. So at this point, I would like to engage us in I want to invite you to take a little journey with me. I've got the Professor Valliere shared an 8-minute video of the process of making this canoe. And I would like to share it with you as they shared it with us. And I've shared it many times at conferences. I promise you that it will be inspiring, and it'll be a moment where we can experience together a little bit about cultural Indigenous educational practice. So here's your assignment, teachers: remain attuned and connected. Please resist the pull of distraction and multitasking, and participate for 8 minutes in something that's a little bit closer to Indigenous practice. And as you watch, please think about how you could create and implement a longitudinal, community-based, standards-based, learning-rich, engagement-empowered project in your classes. Please feel free to share some of your ideas or comments in the chat. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Liz to pull the video up.
All right.
You will love this video. Don't give up. Stay with us.
Yeah, stay with us, folks. Okay, share sound. All right, you should be seeing the video right now. Thumbs up. All right, let me hit play.
See this trimmed over here? because I'll block my world and I'll still get my world. It's like, ooh.
There it goes again. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. All right. Now. That tree. Got to locate him first. There's one. There we go. Pulling it away. Come on. And after that, we cut the hearts out of it.
Working that. That is a sweet smell.
Oh man.
I smelled it from my room. It came
Isn't
all
that
the way
good
out.
smell?
Pull it towards you.
Always falls down.
Someone grab that bottle. Someone grab that bottle.
Okay, there we go. All right. Let me stop share. All right, I was not able to see the chat while that was playing, so I need to get caught up over here. I will say though, what struck me was the first thought that came to my mind was, you know, we live in a world of instant gratification, right? So this is definitely the opposite of that. I think you might be on mute.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, can you
Just
hear me
checking.
okay?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just a completely different approach than, you know, what we see in maybe day to day. All right, let me give you back your time.
Thank you. And yes, I saw some great comments in the chat about the combination of the traditional and modern tools. And Professor Valier mentioned that he said we took a few shortcuts, like we used a hot plate instead of an actual fire, to do some of the stuff. But okay, people, did you think of some examples that we could use in our classrooms that would have that longitudinality and that would have relevance to a community, that you could actually construct that project in school? I know after one of the times I presented on this project and this research in general, I shared this video at a conference. A science teacher came rushing up to me afterwards, and she said, some of my students are mainstream, American English speakers, and some of them are students of, from refugee background. And this is the kind of project I need to get all of them interested in science. And I thought, yeah, kind of like the Somali museum director said, this is how Somali kids learn geometry. Look at the skills that they learned. And Liz, great point about, the kind of idea of patience and perseverance as opposed to quick fix kind of experiences. I guess I'll maintain that I think there's a place for that kind of focus in our educational practices. So let me keep going here with some other, just to kind of like compare overall and see if any of you agree with me. In Western education, kids learn the principles of math, science, technology, engineering, etc., to someday be able to do or make something, probably for a company you have no deep connection to. Whereas in Indigenous education, kids make or do something that benefits the community, and along the way, they learn the principles of math, science, technology, engineering, etc. I think this is one of the key distinctions between formal education and Indigenous traditional oral cultural education. And I have been taught this lesson by so many of the elders that I've talked to and the sources I've been referring to today. So, okay. What about, is there any way we could do elders as fonts of knowledge in our classrooms? I remember in my high school, we'd always have some World War II veteran come in and talk about World War II like one time in a year. But if we have students from oral Indigenous cultures where we know elders are treated with, are considered the knowledgeable center of the community, is there a way to bring them in, treat them like living, breathing libraries, and have them engage and lead the students in meaningful activities? Maybe even publishers, maybe even like Saddleback could put out books for students, like your incredibly great high school readers, where elders are featured. I think those might be some great ideas to pursue. So another value of oral Indigenous cultures that I want to spend a little time talking with you about is specifically the oral mode. So this is such a huge topic, it's impossible to address it even in an hour, and we don't have anything like an hour left. But this is an area of research that I've been immersed in for 15, almost 20 years now. And let me just give you a condensed version, and definitely willing to follow up with anyone who wants to. In Western education, our approach is premised on traditions of literacy. And I mean, I'm literate in 5 languages. I love literacy. But we have to understand, and this is something I didn't understand at first, that our hyper-literate Western education operates around complicated definitions and abstractions. I'll give you a very brief example. Like if you talk to kids about, which kind of like classifying animals, mammals, reptiles, etc., those are incredibly abstract definitions of animals that don't make sense to all cultures. But our education is predicated on kind of like, write the vocabulary in your notebook and the definition with the vocabulary. That's something, unheard of in Indigenous education, which is premised on traditions of orality and based on relationships and meaning. And we've seen some examples today. So question for all of us: how do you transmit knowledge and remember lessons and preserve knowledge that's transmitted orally over centuries without writing? This is barely a little dipping of the toe into the many, many rich practices, but some of the ways that this is done and that are taken extremely seriously and revered are the use of stories and fables and tales. That's why I permitted myself to tell you the stories of Digme and Amadou and Lefty, because I thought, well, okay, let's engage in the storytelling mode for a little bit. This is a primary mode of instruction for the young since time immemorial. In the West, we have some examples. So like the Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen. In fact, there's, the Hansel and Gretel story coming from the Brothers Grimm. There's a Somali kind of a type of a story that's very resonant of the same type story, and it's called Degder. It's about this witch who eats children. Why do we tell these stories to children anyway? But these are ways of teaching the young that are not premised on literacy. So stories, fables, and tales. Another that is incredibly important is Proverbs. I have a colleague here in Minnesota who is working on a whole project to use Proverbs to address mental health questions, because Proverbs, as the Yoruba saying goes, are the horses of discourse. They pull more weight, they give more direction, they do more work than other parts of language. Proverbs teach us something. So if we take, Proverbs in English, I've learned some growing up. For instance, one is absence makes the heart grow fonder. But then we also have out of sight, out of mind. They are exactly opposite. I just wonder if some of our oral culture students, refugee background or Indigenous background, we could also explore with them some proverbs from their culture and language and just see, oh, does it appear like that in your culture too, that sometimes they're opposite, they teach opposite lessons, but we need to know when it applies? Or what are some other proverbs and patterns that your language and culture you can teach us with? That's a major piece of oral culture. Other forms are use of songs and music and drums, and I included some images here of like the Cambodian story dance, a Lakota drum circle, and of course Somalia is known as the nation of poets, Somali poets. If you want to give Somali kids a task that they can relate to, have them memorize a bunch of poetry or have them just do oral poetry. It's an amazing experience, and they come alive like they will not be coming alive when they just read something in a book. So this is just a few examples, but really powerful and things that we could consider using in classrooms in many, many, many ways. And I certainly have, and I'm sure you have as well. So whatever the particular form that the oral modes center on, here's the meta point. Oral culture uses thematic learning that has a community purpose. And I'm not saying that only oral cultures do that, but that is a hallmark and a central point of oral culture. And another one that's super interesting and important, it reminds me of the Amadou and Lefty story, attunement. Listening in order to experience and understand rather than listening to respond. I was a debate student in high school and college. You're listening and you're crafting your argument and you're getting all ready with your points. The minute the other person is done talking, you're going to slam with some counter arguments. That is not the function of listening. It's it's not the only function. It's not the way listening is favored in oral Indigenous culture, which I cannot believe how the amazing experiences I've had. The Sudanese community in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, I went to one of their cultural events, and they have a practice that anybody who goes up to the microphone can talk as long as they want. And so I thought I was going to go to a dinner, and 8 hours later, I emerged somewhat dazed from this auditorium where, you know, it's just, you say all that you want, oral mode, and everybody's listening and connecting. I mean, not necessarily quietly, but it's a different mode of life, and something I think we can implement and use much more in classrooms than we do. So another a really key point of Indigenous education that I learned at the Widening the Circle conference and many other sources are the 4 R's of Indigenous education: respect, reciprocity, relationship, and responsibility. The 4 R's. Sometimes the 3 R's and then one of them is not present. But what do you notice about these? When I ask teachers and participants at conferences, what do they notice? And they're like, well, they all are talking about the same thing: respect, reciprocity, relationship, you know, responsibility. They're kind of all about the same thing. These are, according to Professor Leary and many others I've been reading, these are the core of Indigenous education. And now if we compare this to US state standard documents, I mean, I'm a teacher educator. Can you even think of is there any way to even compare it to the fantastically detailed and explicit standards that students need to show mastery of, each one of them individually? So there's clearly a distinction here. And one point that Professor Leary pointed out very clearly at that conference was, when we're talking about Indigenous education, we're talking about a commitment to participation learning. He said, quoting him, "We sink or swim together." In Lakota, there's the saying, "Mitakoye Oyasin," we are all related. It's not about individuality. It's about the good of the collective. And of course, we're talking about a distinction between highly individualistic American culture and collectivist cultures. So I want to share this because teachers will find this really useful. You're like, how can I add something to my curriculum? Professor Leary says, the 4 R's don't need to be the content. Let them be the lens. So for instance, observe news, events, practices in school or community or wherever, and ask students to identify how they do or don't support the 4 R's. I do this in my classes at St. Olaf College. It's basically a Lutheran college, but we use the 4 R's as a lens. And this kind of addresses what he calls the full basket problem. It's a way of looking at things and analyzing things that is culturally relevant to Indigenous background people, but also incredibly valuable for other students. So another piece of Indigenous education, I'm sorry, time's really, really short now, that I want to evoke, but we won't go into, is that something we're not familiar with that much in the United States at all. In Indigenous education, it's impossible to conceive of knowledge as anything but spiritual. Knowledge is never disconnected or objective or neutral. It's always generated within a sense of spiritual meaning. And that's something that we'll have to think hard as educators about how we can embody that in a culturally relevant way in our classrooms. Very related is a deep respect for the natural world. The great teacher Ed McGaugh has pointed out that, you know, this is the natural world. Mother Earth is essentially the source of spirituality, Wakantanka, or in many of our refugee student backgrounds, the same exact notion that things are sacred and our job is to keep things in balance. As Ed McGaugh says, education should connect us to, not alienate us from, the original purpose of creation. And I'm just going to share a couple of images here. The Native American spirit wheel, the Somali circle of time, and a Hmong shaman using a circle. Same kind of image to demonstrate how things are connected cosmologically. So wrapping this all up, wisdom is the hallmark of a well-educated person. So knowing what to do to enhance the health of the community and the world, rather than simply possessing facts and knowledge that could be used for selfish or harmful purposes, that is the focus of Indigenous education. And I would say most of us educators would agree with that. moral authority, as in, for instance, in education, rests with the one who has healed him or herself, so he or she can heal the world. So, forgive me, allergies. Does any of this resonate for your SLIFE learners, for English learners in general, for American students overall? Obviously, I think it does, and I look forward to engaging with you. Should we incorporate these values in American education? How would we do it? Who would benefit? I'm going to maintain that I think everyone would, as I have tried to share today. So thank you so much for sticking with this and attending today. And I'll turn it over to Liz. I don't know if we have any time for Q&A. I'm up for it.
We have a few minutes, and the questions you had at the end there kind of prompting some thought and conversation. I just wanted to go back through the chat and highlight some of the comments that people have made throughout. And there are a couple of questions as well. So thanks to all of you for hanging on. I told you we were going to go long today. And if you have to go, that I know it's the end of the school day for a lot of you. That's totally fine. You can catch the Q&A on the recording. We will not be offended. So Bonnie talked about how this term she asked her students to share proverbs from their home culture in their own language. And feedback from everyone in her multicultural online class has been positive, and it was very powerful. So I just wanted to kind of shout out to Bonnie for that. And so Corey said, one day, 3 autumns is a proverb in Chinese used to express how much you miss someone, and one day seems as long as 3 years. Yeah. So lots of Enid said, incorporate elders' oral narrative on how to cook their native dishes during a school cultural fair. So lots of chatter and people definitely picking up on the message. There are questions in the Q&A. Those of you who have to go, as I said, we will definitely have this posted up on YouTube so you can see the questions. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And next week we have Anne Monroe joining us. She's going to be discussing creating a shame-free classroom. Now, I know most of you may not think about teaching and learning and practices through a lens of shame, but it's very enlightening when you do. And when we think about how to strengthen and motivate our students and some of the education practices that we may employ unconsciously that are not super helpful potentially. So this is going to be an interesting conversation. I encourage you to join us. So this will be next week at 12 o'clock Pacific, 3 o'clock Eastern. And don't forget, we do have our Go Decode decodable text for tweens now available. You can check out the webinar on that for more information. But most importantly, I want to get to these questions. So Bonnie for sure had made a comment that I said, well, I'm going to get to this. I want to bring up this comment and this question. Bonnie said, sadly, many of us are constrained by program and funding requirements. I wish, in all capitals, I could do a longitudinal project like this, referring to your video. And I'm sure many people sort of share that. I wish that would be great, but. So can we maybe backtrack a little bit and talk about, or not talk about, but reiterate maybe some other things we can do that don't feel so, I guess, enormously different, that it wouldn't have the space and the structure that we know as Western education?
Is this for me, Liz?
Yes, it is. Yes, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm having this little attack of allergies. You know, one thing that came up, well, the teacher I mentioned, she started a science project based on water, and they did it over the entire year. And I'm not sure exactly, I think she had a sheltered classroom for her SLIFE students in high school. But one thing that she thought would be really helpful is to, do any of your schools like have a theme for the year? Like, you know, sometimes it's something like water, or something like a certain animal, or a weather pattern. she said in science, they sometimes look at the curriculum that way, like with a metascope and sequence. So as much as, oh yes, you're so right that it's in, you know, just to think of doing a longitudinal project where you go out and go into the forest and do all kinds of things, that's so difficult to resource. But maybe within, if you work with other teachers, maybe you could identify a theme that different classes hit in different ways using some overarching connecting process. This science teacher, they worked on water, and they looked, so in the ELA classroom, they read I can't remember what story it was, but it had something to do with water. In science, they did experiments on, you know, the surface tension of water. And then in math class, they looked at sort of chemical properties of water that connected to the, you know, mathematical knowledge. But I mean, I think it's a lot of what I have shared today is in the aspirational zone. Like, I realize it's not practical in some cases, but I think these questions are worth raising. And maybe you'll think of things when you go back to your school and classroom, like, oh yeah, we could have something stretch over several units that kind of unites them. So, and a really, really common one that Helene Marshall and Andrea De Capua talk about a lot is project-based learning, doing like a survey, like surveying the oldest people that you know, and do it over time, maybe on a certain topic. Like that, I guess I'm just brainstorming out loud a little bit, but those would be some ideas.
Yeah,
I bet every people participating here have like a million great ideas too.
Bonnie just chimed right in. She said, yes, an overarching theme for a term, or maybe a motif that we could weave in and return to again and again to bring everything together. So, and you know, we've touched on this in other webinars where we've had presenters come in and say things like essential questions are huge, having an overarching guiding principle. We're not just reading to read or you know, making something to make something. We're exploring. And so that has an element of a little bit of what we're talking about as well. Corey says, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I hope to learn more on this topic. And she has taught ENL students for many years and is now teaching teachers. The topic is so important. And she wants to bring bits of it to the culturally responsive, sustaining educational trainings and discussions about teaching and learning. Absolutely. All right. So I want to close out with a couple of questions from Robert, and then we will wrap up because I know we have gone really long today. So I want to.
Oh, Liz, I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
So passionate about this topic, but anyway.
That's that is not a critique at all, but just a more of a thank you to the attendees who are waiting to get their questions answered. So Robert wants to know, he says, might sentence stems, graphic organizers, exit slips be used with sensory support, interactive support for teaching the student population? And forgive me, Robert, if I'm rephrasing your question in a way that is rearranging your question, but I guess, is there room for that sort of thing woven into what you've discussed?
Absolutely, Robert. That is a really great point. In fact, some research and experience has pointed out that things like graphic organizers and exit slips are actually more of a hindrance for some students from oral Indigenous background than they are a help. I love your idea of, you know, using some kind of a sensory element or an experiential element. Maybe instead of an exit slip, you have a secret handshaker. I mean, you know, I guess I'm just brainstorming off the top of my head, but that is a really, really great point. I think what we see, and I'm so engaged with the SLIFE communities in Minnesota and elsewhere for that matter, is that people just they're not able to follow the incredible sort of deadening weight of always just reading, writing, and the teacher talking. And there are other ways that human beings live, you know, through tactile or sensory experience, which we totally saw in the canoe video. But maybe there are other ways that we can build in actual learning. I once, in fact, you'll love this, Robert. I once saw a biology teacher assess a student on the DNA strand with the use of colored paper clips, because that student didn't have a great deal of English, but the student understood the sequencing of the strand and what comes next, which pieces of the protein come next. So I think realia isn't just for elementary, right? Even in high school and adult ed for that matter, using actual objects or sensory experiences, I think is absolutely, that's got to be one of our main foci with this population.
Absolutely. And Robert, to your other questions, he asked also about what about students with limited or interrupted formal education who are not from Indigenous cultures and have minimal literacy.
Yep.
I think a lot of what we've discussed is beneficial for all students, but I'll let you speak to that. He said, well, what about those who don't fit into that particular category?
Yep, absolutely. And it's totally the case that some students arrive in their receiving culture with limited or no literacy in any language, and they're acquiring literacy and schooling in a target language, but they're not from a functioning, intact oral Indigenous culture. Yes, I know that is definitely the case, especially in the case of students who have been trapped in situations, refugee situations for many years, or where the school system has disintegrated in their home country and they haven't had a chance to acquire literacy, but they don't exactly come from oral Indigenous background. I will just say this, I am completely aware of and sensitive to, and have had many students like that in my classes. That group is not my specialty, so I can't speak to it as well, since my specialty is on the students who, I would say most people in our field estimate that the vast majority of SLIFE students come from oral Indigenous background, but that doesn't mean all do. And in fact, some people put in the chat, this reminds me of Hispanic culture or Latinx culture. Absolutely. Like it's not only oral Indigenous, but that's the group I'm focusing on for this in this research. I think they get overlooked a lot. And I think we have an incredible bias in favor of traditions and affordances of literacy. So I'm really interested in this project to represent an underrepresented community. But I would just say that, yeah, that's absolutely, say what Liz said. I took the trouble to set up the whole intergenerational dynamic in the United States first, because I do believe that this kind of knowledge benefits everybody. And I think I myself and my own kids and my grandkids would benefit from it too. It's just that it hasn't been privileged and it hasn't been foregrounded in our classrooms. So I don't see how it could hurt the students who are from those backgrounds either.
And finally, well, this will be our last question for today. Adeline says she would love to have her pre-service teachers share proverbs and funds of knowledge from their culture. But what do I do when all my pre-service teachers are white females and believe they don't have or belong to any particular cultural background? This is an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. So I don't know that there's a correct answer, but it's definitely food for thought. So what ideas do you have around this question?
Adeline, we don't know each other, but I like the way you think. I mean, that is the horns of the dilemma right there, because I would argue that I shared some proverbs from my background, and I have an extremely white background, but it's different than talking about oral Indigenous culture. But I think you might be able to help them dig and find some things. Like you could even bring a copy of the Brothers Grimm to class and have them mine it, or give them a little curated list of sources where they could find some things that you might believe would connect with their home, with their upbringing, whether we will call it a specific cultural background or not. But isn't that just, gosh, that's so teachable, because this idea of this panopticism, that there's some people that really don't even have culture. We're just American. We're the group in charge or whatever. That's just ridiculous. And I think, okay, I'm not going to say your students are ridiculous, but I teach undergrads too, and sometimes these ideas that they come up with, I think that there would be ways to open that up and make that a teachable moment. And I'm not going to say I know what they are, but I think I'm really glad you raised that question, because I think we can find these stories, that we can find these even on like sometimes they appear in American television commercials. Many times commercials are a weird place where proverbs emerge, like they just make an appearance because they're, you know, ad execs are trying to figure out something that lots and lots of people would relate to in the viewing audience. So hey, in the spirit of brainstorming, let me throw those ideas out there. But I really love your smart, thoughtful question.
Thank you so much for that. And shout out to Enid. She said, well, there's always a wise grandparent who speaks in Proverbs in one's family tree. I'm like, so if you ask around enough, maybe you'll find one, you know, or if you listen, I don't know. I don't want to speak about other people's family and family dynamics, but I definitely appreciate the comment. So thank you. Thank you all for your participation today. This is, like I said, we've been wanting to bring this topic to the platform for quite some time because it is not one that gets a lot of airtime, so to speak. So we definitely appreciate you joining us and sticking around to really hear it out and ask questions and engage. We're so thankful for you. And we're so thankful to Jill as well for taking the time to share this conversation with us. And clearly you're very passionate about it. And I think you have just given everybody a lot to think about. Karen says this has been excellent. I agree. This has been excellent. Thank you so much. And you all know the routine. This is where you can find us. And we hope to see you next week to talk about creating a shame-free classroom. And have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you so much.